It was just another quiet Monday morning when the trouble began. The sun was barely peeking through the trees, casting long shadows over the gravel roads. I was out in the yard, fixing up the old chicken coop, a project that had been lingering on my to-do list for weeks. My dog, Scout, trotted around the fence line, sniffing every nook and cranny like he was guarding the White House. All was peaceful, just the way I liked it. But then I saw her, Catherine. She was marching down the road with a determined step, like she was on a mission from some higher authority. I didn't think much of it at first. She had that way about her, always acting like she was the neighborhood sheriff. She wore those big, oversized sunglasses that made her look like a movie villain, her clipboard clutched tightly in her hand like a weapon. It was too early in the morning for this, but it wasn't unusual for Catherine. She was the president of the Hoa, a self-appointed queen who ruled over the smallest details of everyone's lives. Still, I didn't expect her to do what she did next. I paused mid-screwdriver, squinting as I watched her walk straight toward my front gate. That's when I saw her pull something shiny out of her purse, a padlock. My gut sank as I realized what she was about to do. I jogged over to her, dust kicking up from the dry ground beneath my boots, trying to keep calm. "Hey, did you just lock my gate?" I called out. She didn't even flinch, just turned her head slightly, those damn sunglasses reflecting the morning light like she was too good to even acknowledge me properly. "Yes, I did," she said, her voice as sweet as it was condescending. "Per Hoa Ordinance 1 for B. No unapproved structures can remain unlocked. Your gate is an eyesore, visible from the community trail." My mouth went dry. "This isn't a structure, Catherine. This is a private access gate for my property, a private easement," I explained, trying to keep my voice steady. She smiled, that smug, knowing smile, like she had all the answers. "Well, it's visible to the community, and that's all that matters. I've filed several complaints about it," she added, matter-of-factly, as if her word was gospel. I stood there, stunned, trying to process what she was saying. Complaints about my gate. But before I could say anything else, she turned away, already typing something into her phone. "I've documented your non-compliance," she chirped, not even giving me a chance to argue. I stared at her for a moment, fuming, but I knew there was more at stake than just the lock. That gate was more than just a way to keep my driveway secure. Beneath that patch of gravel was the emergency water valve for our town's backup water supply, something I'd helped design and install after the 2017 flood. The same valve that had been a lifesaver during the wildfires of past years. But Catherine didn't care about that. Instead, she pulled out a folding lawn chair and plopped down in front of my gate like she was at a summer picnic. She spent the next few hours sipping kombucha and glaring at anyone who came near, including the Amazon delivery guy, who she tried to redirect down an alley that didn't even exist. As the day dragged on, the temperature climbed higher, and I could feel the tension building. By late afternoon, the wind started to pick up, and the local news began flashing fire warnings. But Catherine just sat there, completely oblivious to what was about to happen. I thought about calling the fire department, giving them a heads up about the gate, but I figured it would all blow over. I was wrong. That night, lightning struck a ridge for miles east, igniting the dry brush with a ferocity that sent flames racing toward our town. I could see the orange glow from my upstairs window before I even smelled the smoke. Sirens blared within minutes, and I heard the fire trucks roaring down the community trail, heading straight for my gate. I sprinted outside, heart pounding. When I got there, Catherine was still sitting in her chair, now in a bathrobe, sipping wine like she was at a spa. A firefighter jumped out of the truck and ran up to the gate. "We need access to the valve," he said urgently. Catherine didn't even look up. "This is private property," she said, almost cheerfully. "No one gets through without Hoa clearance." The firefighter blinked, then tried again, more urgently. "Ma'am, that valve is a critical part of the town's emergency infrastructure. You're obstructing state response." Catherine waved him off, dismissing the urgency with a flick of her hand. "Bring paperwork," she demanded. I couldn't believe it. The fire was right there, and she was still playing her petty HOA games. I didn't have time for this. I turned, ran back to my shed, grabbed a chain, and hooked it to my truck. With a roar of the engine, I floored it, the chain snapping the lock in an instant. The gate swung open, and the fire trucks rolled in, just in time to save the town. Catherine screamed something about legal action, but no one paid her any attention. The fire was contained within hours, but not before one house in the foothills was lost. And so, it began. What started as a simple locked gate would soon become a fight for the town's safety, and the power struggle that followed. It didn't take long for me to realize that Catherine's lock wasn't just a minor nuisance. I had known that my property, the farm with its patchwork of fields and quiet corners, was more than just a home. It was part of a much larger puzzle. Beneath the gravel patch near my gate, buried beneath a metal hatch, lay something that was critical to the entire town's well-being. That's what I kept telling myself when Catherine locked the gate. I should have known better than to assume she would see reason. Catherine, with her clipboard and her exaggerated sense of authority, had made her decision, and nothing would change that in her mind. In her eyes, my private access gate was a problem, a visual blemish, something that didn't fit her version of a perfectly manicured neighborhood. The idea that it was an emergency access point, vital infrastructure for the town, seemed completely lost on her, and to be honest, I knew I couldn't expect her to understand. But the reality of what had happened didn't hit me until much later. I knew what lay behind that gate. I'd helped design the emergency water supply system after the 2017 flood wiped out the town's infrastructure, and I was there when we upgraded the entire system to make it more reliable. That gate wasn't just an ordinary gate, it was part of the lifeblood of our town's safety, and the water valve behind it wasn't something you could just casually lock up without serious consequences. The whole idea of blocking access to it seemed impossible to me at first. What was Catherine thinking? That a padlock on a gate was somehow going to maintain the aesthetic consistency of the neighborhood? I still couldn't wrap my mind around how far she'd go to enforce her idea of perfection, even if it meant putting the entire community at risk. But I knew deep down that I couldn't just let it slide. I didn't act immediately because, in all honesty, I hoped the situation would resolve itself. Maybe Catherine would realize her mistake after a day or two and take the lock off. Maybe the Hoe would step in and put an end to her personal vendetta. But that didn't happen. Instead, Catherine sat across the street, like a sentinel in her lawn chair, sipping kombucha and pretending the rest of the world didn't matter. She didn't care that I was trying to finish my work on the coop, that I had bigger things on my mind than her fixation on visual harmony. I was trying to keep my family's farm running, trying to keep things going after years of hard work. I debated calling the fire department. I debated warning them about the locked gate. But I kept thinking the worst wouldn't happen. The town had been through enough. I had seen the fire warnings on the local news, but I didn't think it would be that bad. We had made it through worse many times before. The weather was dry, sure, but there hadn't been any reports of lightning storms or the kind of heat that could turn a small spark into a raging inferno, or so I thought. By the time the sun started to dip below the horizon, things had taken a turn for the worse. The wind had picked up, and I could feel it carrying something more than just the usual dryness. It was carrying danger. Smoke started to fill the air, faint at first, but quickly growing stronger, creeping into the quiet stillness of the evening. It was then that I finally checked my phone. Scanning the fire map, the wind was pushing a blaze toward our town. The dry brush in the hills had ignited from a lightning strike, and the fire was moving fast. I grabbed my boots and ran out the door, already hearing the sirens in the distance. I wasn't panicking, but I sure wasn't going to stand by while Catherine played her little games. I needed to get to that gate. If the fire department couldn't get through, they'd lose precious time that could mean the difference between saving homes and watching them burn. By the time I got to the gate, the fire trucks were already there, their engines roaring, sirens wailing as they barreled down the community trail. The firefighters jumped out of their trucks, and I could see the desperation in their eyes. They knew what they had to do. The gate had to come down, but it was locked. One of the firefighters rushed to the gate, slamming his hand against it. "We need access to the valve now," he shouted. Catherine didn't even look up. She just kept sipping from her wine glass, like she had all the time in the world. "This is private property," she said calmly, almost condescendingly. "I can't let you through without HOA approval." I couldn't believe it. The audacity. The firefighter tried again, explaining that the valve was part of the emergency infrastructure. The town relied on that water valve, and they needed to get to it now. But Catherine just dismissed them with a wave of her hand, telling them to bring paperwork. I didn't wait. There wasn't time for that. I turned and ran back to my shed, grabbing a chain and hooking it to my truck. My mind was made up. This was bigger than HOA rules. This was about saving lives. With a roar of the engine, I tore the lock off the gate, sending it flying open. The fire trucks rolled in, the firefighters jumping out, running to the valve. The fire was contained within hours, but not before one home had been lost in the hills. The next morning, I knew this wasn't over. I knew Catherine hadn't even realized the disaster she had just caused. She had thought her small, petty authority would hold up, but she had no idea what kind of power she was playing with. The entire town relied on that gate, and blocking it wasn't just a minor inconvenience, it was a life-threatening decision. That lock was no longer just a padlock. It was a symbol of something much bigger, the arrogance of unchecked power. And now, it was time to fight back. The fire raged through the hills like a wild beast, its flames licking the dry air, pushing westward toward our town. I could see the orange glow from my upstairs window even before the acrid scent of smoke reached me. My heart sank as I watched the fire map update in real time. The wind was pushing the flames straight toward us. The emergency water supply was supposed to be a safeguard, something we all depended on in times like this, but Catherine had decided that the aesthetics of a gate were more important than our safety. It's funny how quickly everything can change. One moment, I was standing there, watching her smugly sip kombucha on the other side of the locked gate, and the next, the fire trucks were screaming down the community trail, their sirens splitting the air. I heard the crackle of the radio, the frantic voices of firefighters as they coordinated their response. They had one job: get to that valve before the flames could consume our town. But there was one problem. The damn gate was locked. By now, I knew exactly what was at stake. I had worked on this water infrastructure project from the ground up. The backup valve, buried under a small metal hatch just inside my gate, wasn't just a convenient tool for sprinkling lawns, it was the town's last line of defense in case of a fire. In the years since the 2017 flood, that valve had been used to pump water into our system when the main pipeline went down. Every fire season, the fire department relied on that valve to keep us safe. Now, thanks to Catherine's misguided sense of control, it was effectively sealed shut. I ran outside, heart pounding, and when I reached the gate, the fire trucks were already parked in front of it. The lead firefighter was standing there, hands on his hips, his face etched with frustration. His eyes scanned the locked padlock, and for a brief moment, I saw something close to disbelief flash across his face. "We need access to the valve," he said, his voice tight with urgency. Catherine didn't even look up from her wine glass. She sat there, in her lawn chair, completely oblivious to the seriousness of the situation. "I'm sorry, this is private property," she said, her voice as cold and dismissive as I'd ever heard. "No one gets through here without HOA approval." I felt my blood pressure spike. She was still playing her petty games while the town was in danger. I couldn't stand it anymore. The idea of bureaucracy and regulations standing in the way of saving Liverset made my blood run cold. We were on the verge of a disaster, and Catherine was more concerned with whether or not my gate clashed with her idea of neighborhood harmony. The firefighter tried again. "Ma'am, this is a critical part of the town's emergency response plan. You're obstructing access to life-saving infrastructure." But Catherine, ever the gatekeeper, simply waved her hand as though she were swatting away an annoying fly. "You'll need to bring me the right paperwork before I can let you through. HOA rules are HOA rules," she said, the words dripping with the kind of smug confidence only someone with too much unchecked power could muster. I watched, feeling the seconds tick by like they were hours. Every moment mattered. The fire was getting closer. There wasn't any time to waste on paperwork. The valve was the key to putting out this fire. Without it, the fire department would be forced to drive miles out of their way, burning precious minutes in the process. Minutes that could cost homes and, worse, lives. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Every part of me screamed to take action, to do whatever I could to prevent the inevitable. I couldn't let her stop using it now, not when everything was on the line. Without thinking twice, I turned and sprinted back to my shed, my mind set. I grabbed a thick chain and hooked it to the back of my truck. The sound of the engine roaring to life was the only thing I needed to hear. Before I threw the truck into gear and floored the pedal, the chain snapped the lock in an instant. The gate flew open like it was nothing more than a brittle piece of cardboard. My truck roared into action, and the fire trucks rushed in, their tires kicking up dirt as they drove toward the valve. I watched as the firefighters scrambled, connecting hoses, opening valves, and doing their best to push back the raging inferno that had come too close to our town. Catherine was still sitting there, dumbfounded, like she couldn't believe what had just happened. She shouted something about legal action, but no one was listening. The fire trucks were already in position, and within a matter of hours, the fire was contained. There was still a lot of damage. One house in the foothills was lost, but it could have been much worse. The next day, I gave a statement to a small group of county officials who were still trying to wrap their heads around what had happened. Catherine was nowhere to be found, but her lock, I hung it on my porch with a simple sign that read, "Warning, may cause wildfires." It was a small act of defiance, but it felt good. It was the first sign that things might just turn around, that maybe, just maybe, the town was waking up to what had happened. But as the fire trucks rolled out and the dust settled, I knew it wasn't over yet. Not by a long shot, because once the town realized who had locked that gate and why it had been locked, the entire narrative was about to shift, and this time, Catherine wouldn't be the one in control. The fire was contained within hours, but it wasn't over. Not for me, not for the town, and definitely not for Catherine. She had underestimated the ripple effect that a locked gate could cause, the kind of disruption it could spark in a community that was more connected than she ever realized. As I stood there watching the fire crews pack up their gear, a sense of relief washed over me. The flames hadn't reached our town's core, and that's what mattered most. But I knew one thing for sure: I was going to have to deal with the aftermath. That night, as I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee, I couldn't help but replay everything in my mind. Catherine had locked that gate without a second thought, oblivious to the fact that it was more than just a barrier to my property. It was a life-saving access point for emergency services. Her actions had nearly turned a small fire into a catastrophic disaster, and now she was going to have to face the consequences. The next morning, I went about my day as usual, trying to put the events behind me. But when I walked into Rosie's cafe, I felt the eyes of the entire town on me. It was as if the place had gone quiet in my presence, like I was the subject of a conversation I hadn't been privy to. People stopped chewing, stopped talking, as if the room had frozen in time. I took a deep breath and slowly made my way to the counter. Rosie, who had always greeted me with a warm smile, simply set her coffee pot down, her expression serious. "You the guy with the gate?" a voice called from the back. I nodded, unsure of what to expect. "Yeah." Didn't realize locking a gate would turn into a town-wide scandal. An older woman near the counter crossed her arms and sighed. It wouldn't have been if that woman hadn't locked the only access to our emergency water system. Her voice was sharp, and I could feel the anger in her words. "My brother's house nearly went up in flames last night," she added, her eyes narrowing. Rosie, ever the peacemaker, piped up from behind the counter. "You know, Karen filed a complaint against you this morning," she said, her tone flat. "Claimed you damaged whole property when you broke the lock." She gave a small chuckle. "The sheriff already tossed it in the trash, but thought you should know." A few people nearby laughed under their breath, clearly relieved that someone was finally calling out Karen. A man in overalls leaned over and whispered to me, "She's been calling herself the waterfront coordinator." He snorted. Told my wife she had the authority to inspect our garden hose for non-compliance. I couldn't help but smile at the absurdity of it all. So she's been busy, huh? I said, shaking my head. That was putting it mildly. Catherine hadn't just locked my gate. She had been on a one-woman crusade, scrutinizing every corner of the neighborhood for any perceived violations of her own personal code of conduct, from untrimmed hedges to children's basketball hoops. Catherine had taken it upon herself to be the sole enforcer of HOA rules. As I listened to the conversations around me, it became clear that Catherine had pushed the town too far. The town wasn't just frustrated, it was angry. And when people get angry, they start talking, and that's when things begin to shift. The quiet murmurs around the cafe grew louder as people exchanged their frustrations, recounting their own run-ins with Catherine's overreaching authority. But it wasn't just the locals who were upset. Word spread fast, and before long, the town council had called for an emergency meeting. It was clear that this was no longer just about a lock gatit. Was about the larger issue of Catherine's unchecked power, and how far she had gone to manipulate the HOA for her own purposes. I got a call from Councilman Devers, who personally invited me to speak at the meeting. His words were blunt, but encouraging. "You're the only one who knows what that gate is really for. We need to set the record straight before she rewrites the narrative with glitter and passive-aggressive signage." I didn't hesitate. This wasn't just my fight anymore, it was the town's. I had the facts, I had the documents, and I had the moral high ground. It was time to take action. I walked into the town hall that evening with a clean shirt and a folder full of blueprints and official documents. The room was packed, standing room only. People lined the walls, and others even stood out in the hallway, eager to see what would happen next. The tension in the air was palpable. At the front of the room, Catherine sat in her pristine white pantsuit, her clipboard still clutched in her hands, her smile as smug as ever. Mayor Schultz opened the meeting with a simple question. "Can someone explain what happened at Gate E17 during yesterday's fire response?" I stood up, my hands steady as I unfurled the blueprint of the town's emergency water system across the council table. "Gate E17 isn't just a gate," I said, my voice carrying through the room. "It's the only accessible route for emergency responders to reach the reserve water main beneath Ridgeview. This isn't speculation. It's codified in the town's emergency response plan and tied directly to the fire department's GPS routing system." Catherine immediately raised her hand, trying to interject, but I wasn't about to let her hijack the conversation. "You're right about one thing," I continued. "It is private property, mine. And it's also federally designated as a secondary access corridor for emergency utilities, which overrides any local or private governance, including the HOA." Gasps rippled through the room. The shock was evident on people's faces. For the first time, they were hearing the truth, full truth. The fire department had been forced to take a much longer route because Catherine's decision had obstructed their access to the valve. One home had been lost because of it. Catherine tried to speak again, but the mayor cut her off. "We've heard quite enough," he said. "The consequences of your actions are clear. We'll be reviewing potential civil liability for obstruction and evaluating the HOA's responsibility in this matter." The room erupted in applause. The town had spoken, the truth had come out, and Catherine, for the first time in a long while, wasn't in control anymore. The days following the town hall meeting were a blur of activity, and as much as I wanted to savor the small victory, I knew it wasn't over. Catherine may have been publicly embarrassed, but she wasn't someone who would back down quietly. Even after the mayor's harsh words, the fire department's swift response, and the town's overwhelming support for the truth, I knew she wasn't going to let this go. In fact, if anything, her defeat had only made her more determined to cling to whatever power she had left. It wasn't long before I received the first of many notices in my mailbox. I had expected some kind of backlash, but I never imagined just how petty Catherine's next move would be. The letter was from the HOA, signed by the board members, accusing me of unauthorized destruction of HOA property and vehicular misuse on shared land. The audacity of it all was almost laughable. I had, after all, been the one who had literally saved the town, but here they were, trying to find any way to pin this on me. The notice came with a hefty fine attached, and I could feel my blood pressure rise as I read through the details. It was as if Catherine had gone through every possible rule book, trying to find something anything hold against me. But what struck me the most wasn't the fine itself. It was the fact that they had the nerve to accuse me of damaging the lock. Damaging the lock that had been the catalyst for the whole disaster, the lock that had nearly cost the town its safety, the lock that, in her delusional pursuit of controlling everything, had put the entire community at risk. I felt a mixture of anger and disbelief, but the worst part was that I knew Catherine wasn't going to stop there. By the next morning, it became clear that Catherine wasn't the only one behind this. She had manipulated the whole board into backing her up, playing the role of the victim in this scenario. It wasn't just about the lock anymore, it was about her ego. She had lost face in front of the entire town, and she wasn't going to take that lying down. I wasn't going to let her get away with it, though I'd fought too hard to let this slide. I called my friend Darren, a local paralegal, who had helped me in the past with some legal matters around the farm. He owed me a favor after I'd helped him install a gray water system in his cabin last year. When I told him what had happened, he immediately sprang into action, eager to help me take on Catherine and her board. "Let me guess," Darren said when he picked up the phone. "Karen's up to her usual tricks." I chuckled bitterly. "You could say that. She's trying to find me for the damage to the lock, and she's dragging the whole board into it. But it's not just that. She's trying to rewrite the narrative, make herself look like the victim, and me the villain." Darren didn't hesitate. "Well, that's not going to fly. Let's see what we can dig up." I met him a few hours later at his office, and we spread the documents out in front of us like we were preparing for a legal battle. We went over the HOA bylaws, the original easement agreement from 2017, and the emergency access maps. Catherine had made a serious mistake that she clearly didn't fully understand. Darren pulled up a copy of the easement agreement that had been signed by the previous HOA president. It was still active, and it clearly stated that any emergency access corridors, such as the one that ran through my property, could not be obstructed or regulated by private associations or individuals. That was gold. Catherine had violated this agreement when she locked the gate. "We've got her," Darren said, his voice filled with confidence. "This is a clear violation of federal regulations. Blocking emergency access is a serious offense, and you've got all the proof you need." I couldn't help but smile. Finally, the tables were turning. Catherine's petty power play was about to blow up in her face. We didn't waste any time. We filed a formal complaint with the county zoning office and sent the relevant documents to the Regional Infrastructure Authority. By the end of the day, I received confirmation that both agencies had opened investigations into Catherine's actions. But that wasn't all. We had one more ace up our sleeve. Later that evening, I received a phone call from the fire marshal himself. He had seen the evidence we submitted, and he was appalled. "Jordan," he said, his voice grave, "we're referring this to the state's Emergency Oversight Committee. This is bigger than we thought. You're talking about obstructing critical infrastructure during an active emergency. That's a criminal offense." I felt a chill run down my spine. This wasn't just about a petty HOA dispute anymore, it had escalated to a matter of national security. The following morning, I got a knock on my door. I opened it to find the county officials standing on my porch, holding files in their hands. They were here to inform me that Catherine was now under investigation by several government departments. She had no idea what she had gotten herself into. But it didn't end there. The real kicker came a few hours later when the news vans showed up. Channel 5, Channel 9, and even a local radio station descended on the town. Perhaps a neighbor had leaked the internal HOA emails to the press. And when the story hit the airwaves, it went viral. The headlines read, "Local HOA President Blocks Emergency Access During Fire. Claims Authority to Override County Infrastructure." The footage of the town hall meeting, where I had laid out the facts, was replayed on a loop. Catherine's facer smug expression, as she defended her actions, was plastered across every screen. Social media exploded, and before long, memes were circulating about Karen's lock, and the hashtag Karen lockdown was trending. I watched as the public opinion shifted. The tide had turned. People were finally starting to see Catherine for who she really was, who was more concerned with her power than with the safety and well-being of the very people she claimed to represent. By noon, I received another letter from the HOA. This time, it wasn't a fine. It was an acknowledgement of the situation, a carefully worded letter stating that they would reconsider the temporary suspension of the easement agreement due to the newly revealed information. They were backpedaling, and I couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction. But I wasn't done yet. I had one more card to play. I called Darren again, and together, we launched a formal challenge to the HOAS bylaws. This time, we were going after Catherine's position. If she was going to cause this much harm to the community, she had no place in the HOA. It was time to put an end to her reign of terror once and for all. As the dust settled and the fallout from the fire response began to subside, it was clear that the battle was far from over. While the public outcry and the investigations by the county zoning office and regional infrastructure authority were making waves, Catherine was still a formidable force. She wasn't just going to slink away into the shadows, nursing her bruised ego. No, she was going to fight, and unfortunately for her, this time she was playing a dangerous game. I knew that the public shaming and the legal pressure wouldn't be enough to bring her to her knees. As much as the town had rallied behind the truth, Catherine was a woman who believed in her own infallibility. She had spent years molding the HOA into her own personal playground, and the idea that she might lose that power was simply unacceptable to her. So I braced myself for what came next, something I knew would be messy, but was certain had to happen. By the time the next notice arrived in my mailbox, I had already prepared myself for the worst. It wasn't a surprise, really, but that didn't make the sting of it any less sharp. Catherine had filed another complaint, this time with the HOA board. She had officially accused me of disrupting the HOAS peace and creating an unsafe environment for neighbors. She even went as far as accusing me of inciting panic and undermining the authority of the HOA itself. This wasn't just a grievance. It was an outright assault on my character, and it was one more attempt to rewrite the narrative in her favor. I could feel the anger bubbling up inside me as I read through the letter. Catherine was pulling out all the stops, using her position as president to create a fabricated story that painted me as the villain. Worse, she was trying to portray the fire department's success in containing the blaze as some kind of fluke, something I had nothing to do with. It was as if all the work the town had done to ensure we were prepared for this kind of disaster meant nothing to her. Her pride was her fortress, and she was determined to protect it at all costs, even if it meant tearing down someone else in the process. But I wasn't about to let her have the last word. I wasn't going to let her spin this into a tale of victimhood when I had the truth on my side. No, I needed to do something more, something that would finally put an end to her reign of terror. And this time, I wasn't going to be fighting alone. I called Darren, my trusted ally in this mess. He had helped me navigate the legal labyrinth before, and now I needed his expertise more than ever. He arrived at my place later that afternoon, and we sat down with the growing pile of paperwork that Catherine had generated. As we pored over the complaints, fines, and her fabricated accusations, Darren's face grew more and more incredulous. "She's really going all in on this," he said, shaking his head. "But she's making a huge mistake. Every accusation she's making is a direct attack on your credibility, and we can prove that. You have the law on your side." I nodded, feeling the weight of the situation. Darren was right. The more we dug into the documents, the more it became clear that Catherine had overstepped in every way imaginable. She had been playing a dangerous game, trying to control the HOA and push her personal agenda at the expense of the town's safety. The fire had been the tipping point, but her actions had been building up for years. "We need to go after her position on the board," I said, my voice steady despite the frustration bubbling inside me. "It's time for her to answer for everything she's done. This isn't just about a locked gate anymore. It's about a pattern of abuse. We need to show the town what she's been doing behind closed doors." Darren grinned, a spark of excitement in his eyes. Now you're talking. Let's hit her where it hurt your seat at the table. We spent the next few days compiling everything we had, documents, emails, and a timeline of Catherine's increasingly erratic behavior as HOA president. But we didn't stop there. Darren had a few tricks up his sleeve, and I trusted him completely. He dug deeper, uncovering more emails between Catherine and the other board members. Messages where she'd threatened to remove homeowners from the HOA for the most minor infractions. And worse, where she'd alluded to using her position for personal gain. It was damning, and I knew we had the ammunition we needed. Armed with this new evidence, Darren and I filed a formal complaint with the HOA, requesting an emergency vote to remove Catherine from the board. The process wasn't easy, but we had a strong case. The board couldn't ignore the growing unrest among the homeowners, and the fact that Catherine's actions had led to a dangerous situation only made our argument stronger. We also brought up the fact that her refusal to acknowledge the town's emergency infrastructure protocols had endangered the lives of her neighbors. There was no way the board could overlook that. It didn't take long for word to spread. People were talking about the emergency vote, and it wasn't just the usual suspects in the HOA who were upset. The entire town was beginning to wake up to what Catherine had been doing. Neighbors who had once kept their heads down now found their voices. People were coming forward, sharing their own stories of Catherine's overreach, and the pressure was building. The day of the vote was tense. I showed up with Darren, our evidence in hand, ready to make the case for Catherine's removal. The atmosphere in the room was thick with anticipation. Homeowners filled the seats, and the room buzzed with whispers. Catherine was there too, of course, sitting in her usual spot at the head of the table, her clipboard firmly in hand, as though she were still in charge. When the vote came, it was swift. The room erupted in applause as Catherine's removal from the HOA board was confirmed. The majority had spoken, and it was clear Catherine's reign of control had come to an end. But it wasn't just the end of her leadership. It was the beginning of a new chapter for the neighborhood. The air felt different now, lighter, as if a burden had been lifted from our shoulders. No longer would we live under the shadow of Catherine's tyrannical rule. And for the first time in a long while, we all breathed a little easier, knowing that our community was safe again, not just from the fire, but from the person who had put us all at risk. As I walked out of the meeting, I couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. We had taken back control not just of the HOA, but of our town. The following week felt like a fresh start for the town. After the chaos of Catherine's reign and the emergency vote that had led to her removal from the HOA board, there was a palpable sense of relief in the air. People were no longer walking around in fear of the next arbitrary fine or the next letter accusing them of some minor infraction. For the first time in years, the town seemed to be breathing freely again, and I could feel the difference. The weight of the last few months' battles, the fights, the frustration seemed to lift with every passing day. But while it felt like a new beginning, I knew that the work was far from over. Catherine's removal from the HOA board was a significant victory, but the damage she had caused wouldn't disappear overnight. The town had been under her thumb for too long, and there were still those who feared her or didn't know how to step forward and take back control of their own community. It would take time to rebuild trust, to heal from the scars left by her petty power plays. Despite the sense of relief, I couldn't ignore the fact that Catherine hadn't simply given up. She had retreated, yes, but I knew she was still out there, lurking in the background, trying to make her next move. And I could feel it in the way she carried herself now, more calculated, more cautious. It was like she had retreated into a shell, waiting for the right moment to strike back. She wasn't one to admit defeat easily, and as much as I tried to push her out of my mind, I knew that she wasn't finished with me yet. The real test came a few days after the vote, as I was walking through town, feeling the unfamiliar ease of knowing things were shifting in the right direction. I saw her Catherine. She was standing near the old community center, her arms crossed, her gaze intense as she watched the ongoing renovations that were being planned to update the building. I couldn't help but stop and stare for a moment. She wasn't holding her clipboard this time. There was no smug smile on her face. She looked defeated. But even in defeat, Catherine was dangerous. I walked up to her cautiously, trying to gauge what she was thinking. It was clear she wasn't here for a friendly chat, and I had no interest in rehashing old arguments. But she was the one who spoke first, and I couldn't help but listen as she turned toward me with an air of wounded pride. "I see you're still here," she said, her voice tinged with bitterness. "I suppose it was only a matter of time before the town decided it wanted to get rid of me." I held up my hands in a gesture of peace. "It's not about getting rid of anyone, Catherine," I said, trying to keep the conversation calm. "It's about making sure things are done the right way, for the safety of the community." Her eyes narrowed as she glared at me. "Right way," she muttered under her breath. "You think you're the hero now, don't you? The one who saved the town. But let me tell you something, Jordan. You may have won the battle, but you haven't won the war." I knew this was coming. Catherine wasn't the type to back down. Even when she had been shown the error of her ways, she was still holding on to her old sense of entitlement, her belief that she had the right to control everything and everyone. And that was the real problem, the way she had manipulated the Hoa, the way she had tried to shape the entire town to fit her own vision of perfection, no matter the cost. I took a deep breath and steeled myself. "I'm not interested in a war, Catherine. I'm just trying to make sure that this town is safe, that we're looking out for each other. You don't get to decide that for everyone." Her lips curled into a tight smile. "You think this is over, don't you? That you've won, and that everything's going to go back to normal?" She paused, looking around the town square. "You're wrong. I built this neighborhood. I made the rules, and I can tear it all down just as easily as I put it together." The arrogance in her voice sent a chill down my spine. It was the same old Catherine, the one who thought she could control everything with a flick of her wrist. But this time, I wasn't going to let her get away with it. The town had seen who she really was, and that was something she couldn't erase. "I'm not going to let you tear anything down," I said firmly, standing my ground. "You've had your chance. Now it's time for the rest of us to rebuild, to make this town better, not just for us, but for everyone." Catherine didn't say anything for a long moment. She just stood there, staring at me, her face hardening with each passing second. It was as if she was weighing her options, trying to decide whether or not she should make one last attempt to regain control. Finally, she let out a sigh and turned away. "You think you've won, but I'll be back," she said, her voice low. "This isn't over." I watched her walk away, the familiar sense of determination in her steps. But this time, it was different. She wasn't in control anymore. The town had spoken, and they had made it clear that her reign of terror was over. As I stood there, watching her disappear into the distance, I couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. The fight wasn't over, but the tide had turned. Catherine had underestimated the power of a united community. The town was stronger now, more determined to keep moving forward, and I had no doubt that whatever came next, we would face it together, and together, we would make sure that no one like Catherine would ever have the power to hold us back again. Valuable lesson. The story of Catherine's control over the neighborhood and the eventual uprising against her is a powerful reminder that we all have a responsibility to stand up for what's right. Even when it feels difficult or uncomfortable in life, there will always be people who try to control others, whether through authority, fear, or manipulation. But the most important thing we can do is recognize when something is wrong and take action, no matter the cost. This is a lesson in community, too. It's easy to feel like one voice doesn't matter, but as we saw, one voice can spark change, can ignite action, and can bring an entire town together to make things right. Don't underestimate the power of standing up for what you believe in, especially when others are too afraid to speak out. The truth has a way of coming to the surface, and when we work together, we can overcome even the toughest challenges. The other lesson here is about taking ownership. While Catherine tried to control others, the real power lies in being responsible for your own actions, decisions, and the impact you have on those around you. Take pride in your community, your relationships, and the values you hold dear. Don't let anyone steal that from you. Stand firm, be kind, and know that every action you take ripples out, affecting the world in ways you might not even see. And so, the town began to rebuild. The toxic grip of control, that had once held so many people in fear was now broken. People were speaking up, standing together, and embracing the power of collective action. What Catherine failed to realize was that leadership isn't about power or control. It's about lifting others up and doing what's best for the community. The real leaders in the town had already shown themselves ones who fought for what was right, not just what was convenient. As for Catherine, her time was up. She may have been able to break a few locks, but she couldn't break the spirit of a community determined to protect what mattered most. In the end, it was the kindness, the unity, and the courage of the people that triumphed. Thank you for joining me in this journey of standing up, speaking out, and doing the right thing. If you found this story inspiring, be sure to hit that subscribe button and leave a comment below with your thoughts. How do you stand up against those who try to control or intimidate? Let's keep the conversation going. Your voice matters, and together, we can make sure the world hears it.